Following the end of World War II, the Japanese-occupied territory of Korea was divided between the USA and the USSR. After attempts to unify the country during the late 1940s failed, tension began to build along the 38th parallel. This was primarily due to the reluctance of the Soviets to take any part in unification proceedings. An Iron Curtain fell between North and South Korea. In 1948, the Americans sponsored the formation of the Republic of Korea in the region south of the 38th parallel. At the same time, the Soviets sponsored the formation of the Korean People's Democratic Republic in the north, both sides claiming to be the legitimate government of Korea. The regime in the north immediately set about to bring down the South Korean government through subversive activities, propaganda, and as time went on, more violent and threatening methods. In June 1950, the North Korean government presented two proposals for the amalgamation of the North and South Korean assemblies. These two proposals were biased toward the North and rejected outright by the South. On the 25th of June, 5 days after the rejection of the second proposal, the North Korean People's Army launched offensives along the border. The Korean War had begun. On that same morning, 77 Squadron Sergeant's Mess received a telephone call from the operations officer, United States 5th Air Force, to the effect that North Korea had attacked South Korea and warning that the squadron may be called upon to help do something about it. 2 days later, the United Nations Security Council met and declared that the North Korean action constituted a breach of the peace and called on member nations for assistance. The Australian government advised 77 Squadron on the last day of June that it was to assist in policing Korea under the command of the US 5th Air Force. Thus, 77 Squadron was to have the distinction of being the first Commonwealth unit to participate in the conflict.
Commanding officer of 77 Squadron is quiet, efficient Wing Commander Lou Spence, DFC. Each morning he says so long to his wife and children, and like millions of civilians, leaves for the office, which happens to be the Korean front line. When he says he's had a hard day at the office, his wife believes him. In operations room, intelligence deals out the gen for the day's strike. Interest is in the Taegu bulge, where North Koreans are making an all-out effort to capture the city and vital airstrip. They will strike at the enemy within 5 miles of the strip.
77 Squadron flew its first mission of the Korean War on the 2nd of July 1950, providing air cover for the United States Air Force C-47 transports evacuating wounded back to Japan. The second mission consisted of 6 pilots, led by Flight Lieutenant Stuart Brick Bradford, as they escorted USAF B-29s on a mission to bomb the airfield at Hamhung in North Korea, a sortie of almost 6 hours.
We had to escort 12 B-29s who were going to bomb an airfield at Hamhung, which is up on the Russian-Manchurian border. So we 6 got airborne and flew out over the straits between Korea and Japan, met these B-29s, and then flew with them, escorted them all the way up the coast, right up to Hamhung, and did the bombing raid over Hamhung. And heavy anti-aircraft, and these people, I admire them. They all, in close formation, started bursting all around them. They flew over the airfield and started dropping their bombs, and their bombs started inside the airfield perimeter, went right down the runway and stopped inside the perimeter and didn't hit anything else at all. That was the idea of it, which was incredible stuff. And then came back out again, and we followed them all around, and we got shot at quite violently on the way out, and then we started to fly back down south again. Down south again, we got attacked by 2 Yaks, piston engine Russian aeroplane, but only made one pass at the first B-29, who fired back and never saw him again. Then on the way back down, they called up and said they had identified a submarine somewhere on the coast. Could we have a look for it? So 1 B-29 and 2 Mustangs left, went down low level and flew on the coast for about an hour, couldn't find anything at all, and linked up with them again. And then when we got down the bottom end of the straits between Korea and Japan, they headed off once again back. They'll go back to Okinawa, and we came back and landed back at Iwakuni, We were airborne for over 6 hours, and they were airborne for 12 hours. That was the first mission.
This task of escorting transports and bombers was soon discontinued due to an almost total lack of North Korean air activity. The squadron's first ground attack mission was flown on the 3rd of July 1950 when 8 Mustangs, led by Wing Commander Lou Spence, attacked targets on the road between Haitaku and Suwon. The squadron destroyed 2 locomotives, 1 truck, 6 other vehicles, and damaged a bridge. Prior to the mission, the CO had misgivings about the target area being in North Korean hands. He rechecked the details with the 5th Air Force Control Center at Itazuke, only to be assured that it was a definite North Korean target. However, when the squadron reached the area, one of the locomotives was seen to carry South Korean markings. Flight Lieutenant John Bay Adams radioed to an American forward air control aircraft further south and was assured that the area was in enemy hands. The flight then proceeded to destroy the targets. However, after the pilots returned and were relaxing, the sickening news arrived that the trucks had been carrying South Korean and American troops of an advanced battalion. General Partridge, commander of the 5th Air Force, called personally to apologize, and the commanding general of the Far Eastern Air Forces, General Stratemeyer, also apologized. It was clear that 77 Squadron was blameless. The event, however, did have a salutary effect on the US system of target allocation. The squadron suffered its first casualty on the 7th of July 1950 when squadron leader Graham Strout failed to return from an attack on targets of opportunity along the north coast of Korea. It was assumed he had been shot down by ground fire. Because of the vast distances between the RAAF station at Iwakuni in Japan and targets in North Korea, it became necessary to stage aircraft through the Korean airstrip of Taegu. The Mustangs would depart Iwakuni each morning, attack their allotted targets, and land at Taegu for refueling and rearming. This arrangement also made it possible to mount a further attack on the North Koreans before the aircraft returned to Iwakuni. During the first month of fighting, the squadron flew a total of 1,337 flying hours and suffered the loss of 1 Mustang and pilot. Keith Meggs describes a typical sortie.
Going up looking for a road that there might have been trucks or even carts driven by horses or cattle. We knew that they were coming down with rifles and ammunition, but anything that we saw that we thought was feeding to the North Koreans before they got driven across the 38th parallel. So we were looking for those with rockets. We had 6 rockets and perhaps 2 500-pound bombs under the wings of the Mustang, plus 1,880 rounds of .5 ammunition. So whatever target came up, you'd use what was appropriate. So if you saw tanks, you'd fire rockets at them, try and dismantle them, you might say. If you saw a train, you might drop bombs on it, or a tunnel with a train in it. Anything at all. Trucks coming down a highway. Eventually it got to the stage where the highways moving down to the south were all given recognition, and 2 aircraft would go up along, say 100 miles of those, looking for any movements. But if there was nothing there, you could bomb a bridge or a railway line to discourage anything coming down.
The war had not been going well for UN forces as the communists continued to advance south. By the end of July 1950, UN forces had been pushed back to an area south of the Naktong River near the town of Pusan, and there was a desperate struggle to hold the town. In that same month, the hard work of 77 Squadron was acknowledged, and they were awarded the coveted Duke of Gloucester Cup, an annual award for the most efficient RAAF squadron. The squadron's Mustangs worked with ground controllers who guided the pilots onto enemy positions. The controllers were situated close to the enemy front line to ensure accuracy. Often, the ground controller would be out of view of the enemy. In this situation, an air controller flying a light aircraft, such as an Oster, would be used to direct the Mustangs onto the target. As well as flying close support missions, the Mustangs of 77 Squadron were also directed to attack the enemy lines of supply and communication. It was hoped that by destroying these vital targets, the enemy would be sufficiently weakened, enabling the UN forces under siege at Pusan to break out. To achieve this, Mustangs carried out attacks on railways, bridges, roads, and supply dumps during August. The enemy often used railway tunnels to hide trains and equipment from air attack. The tunnels drew repeated attacks from the rocket-armed Mustangs. On the 9th of August 1950, during an attack on a town suspected of harboring enemy troops, Stan Williamson was hit by anti-aircraft fire. Williamson found that he could not lower his flaps for landing and crash-landed his aircraft at Pohang. He was fortunate to walk away uninjured, although his aircraft was written off. On the 22nd of August, the squadron's CO, Wing Commander Spence, was awarded the American Legion of Merit for outstanding leadership, devotion to duty, and great personal courage. The decoration was the first to be awarded to a member of the squadron in the Korean conflict. September began tragically when, on the 3rd, William Billy Harrop crashed 5 miles from Taegu. Harrop had been part of a 4-aircraft formation providing cover for USAF B-29 bombers attacking the North Korean coastal town of Pyongyang. On the 9th of September, worse was to come when 4 Mustangs led by the CO attacked the town of Angangni with rockets and machine guns. The weather was bad, with low cloud creating poor visibility and hazardous flying conditions. The CO, Wing Commander Spence, was seen to commence a steep attacking dive from 700 feet onto the target when he was apparently struck by ground fire and crashed into the ground. He was killed instantly.
But he dived in with his wingman over a target called Angangni, and somewhere along down the line he was hit. Well, see, it only takes one round to hit a pilot, and depending on how many people were firing at him, well, he didn't recover. He just kept on diving, hit the ground. And they went in later on, an Air Force padre, and actually found the wreck and the remains. But he was obviously hit by ground fire. A terrible further depression over everybody. And we had luckily have blokes like Bay Adams, who was an old wartime pilot who'd been through it before, and he was managed to boost us all up again and say, that's what it's all about, it's for real, so just got to face up to it. Which we did, and you start to accept losses in as part of way of life.
On the 15th of September, in an attempt to split the enemy forces in two, General MacArthur landed the 10th US Marine Corps at Incheon near Seoul. Caught between this force and the US 8th Army fighting its way up from Pusan, the North Koreans were at last put on the defensive. The UN forces recaptured the South Korean capital of Seoul, and a concerted effort to push the enemy back to the Manchurian border now began. The squadron operations gradually moved north with the advancing ground forces. The squadron's aircraft repeatedly struck at the enemy supply lines and communications, in particular the North Korean rail system, which commanded special attention. The ground forces moved swiftly, and by the end of the month, 77 Squadron Mustangs were roaming deep into North Korea. By the end of September 1950, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. It was decided that 77 Squadron would move from Iwakuni to a Korean airfield from which the Mustangs could strike at North Korean targets without having to transit long distances. On the 12th of October, the squadron relocated to Pohang, known as Airfield K3, situated on the east coast of South Korea, and began operations against the enemy the next day.
3 moves over in Korea. The first one was to Pohang, down on the southeast side of the coast. Then it was up to a place that usually is called Hamhung, but the city's up in North Korea, and in fact the base was at Yonpo, but up north in Hamhung, to be closer to the scene of operations, because by this time the Allied forces had driven the North Koreans up back, and this was past the 38th parallel, the old border. But that didn't last long at all, because then the Chinese came into the war, and very soon we got deeply involved, our squadron, in defending the Allied forces up in North Korea, who were being driven back by very big Chinese forces. And it was that stage that the MiG-15 started to come into the war and so on. Although we didn't see them from our Mustangs. The Americans with their Sabres were a little bit involved with MiG-15s. But we only lasted there a few weeks and were driven right back, well, not necessarily driven, but we did evacuate right back south to a place called Taegu, right on the southern border of Korea. So we had those 3 changes there.
On the 19th of October, 4 Mustangs, led by Squadron Leader Cresswell, set out from Pohang to attack targets close to the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. They attacked an enemy position holding up the UN advance, as well as destroying a train to the north of Pyongyang. The North Korean capital was captured on the 19th of October by the advancing UN forces as they pushed towards the Yalu River, which forms the border between Korea and Manchuria. On the 20th of October, No. 91 Wing was formed at Iwakuni and became operational on the 1st of November 1950, which included 77 Fighter Squadron. The wing was placed under the operational control of the Commander-in-Chief United Nations Korea and the administrative control of the Commander-in-Chief British Commonwealth Occupation Force. To keep as close to the front lines as possible, on the 16th of November 1950, the squadron moved north to Airfield K-27 at Yonpo near Hamhung. The move was supported by C-119 transport aircraft of the USAF. The Chinese and North Korean forces now started to push the UN forces south. The squadron's Mustangs attacked the enemy transports and flew in close support of the embattled UN forces. For the first time since the start of the conflict, 77 Squadron was called upon to support Australian troops who were making a counter-attack against Chinese forces at Pohang. The squadron's Mustangs flew constant attacks against swarms of enemy tanks and vehicles as they moved along the roads leading from Manchuria, inflicting heavy casualties. On the 24th of November, General MacArthur ordered the UN forces onto the offensive, but the situation was hopeless.
On 24 November, the 8th Army launches its all-out assault. Forward elements of the Marines reach Udam. Suddenly and without warning, the Chinese attack. They checked the 8th Army advance and blocked the 10th Corps at Udam. But the 8th Army's right flank receives the heaviest blow. It disintegrates, and Chinese sweep south in overwhelming numbers. Elements of the 3rd deploy.
The 1st Division of US Marines found themselves surrounded by 7 enemy divisions, and for the first time in their history were, as their general put it, ordered to advance in another direction. As the UN ground forces retreated to South Korea, all available aircraft moved to the airfield at Yonpo, inside the Hamhung-Hungnam defense perimeter. At Yonpo, tension mounted as the enemy advanced ever closer to the airfield. All personnel were ordered to carry firearms and to prepare to defend the base. Bad weather was hampering operations at snowbound Yonpo, and the ground crews worked ceaselessly in subarctic conditions to keep Mustangs airworthy. Finally, word was received to abandon the airfield. The airfield K-9 at Pusan was known locally as Dogpatch, but senior Far East Air Force officers renamed it Unityville to reflect the spirit of UN purpose. The squadron continued to hit enemy targets and provide reconnaissance missions through to the new year, and lost their 6th pilot, Sergeant Donald Ellis, in December when he was shot down by ground fire on a reconnaissance mission near Pyongyang. On the 4th of January 1951, the Chinese armies captured Seoul, which had now changed hands for the 3rd time. 2 days later, the squadron suffered a further casualty when Sergeant Jeffrey Stevens crashed on flat ground near Munsan during an armed reconnaissance sortie. Then, on the 19th, the squadron was ordered to attack the Chinese Communist Forces headquarters in Pyongyang and would fly the mission as a complete squadron of 12 Mustangs.
We had occasion to target a Chinese Communist headquarters in Pyongyang when we were operating from way down South Korea. And the operation was to comprise 77 Squadron going in with 16 aircraft, 16 Mustangs, and the USAF coming over was B-29 bombers. Now, they were supposed to come through, if I remember rightly, about 20 seconds before we came in. Our and they would saturate the target and give us a pretty clear go at this headquarters. And over Pyongyang, there was flak like you wouldn't believe. We had 8 airplanes doing bombing and 8 airplanes doing rockets and bombing, and 8 doing rockets and napalm. I was a napalmer. Bombers went in first. As they were going in, they're flying through hundreds and hundreds of bloody bombs being dropped by B-29s, who are 20 seconds late. And, you know, this is, when I say plus or minus 5 seconds, this is what we're talking about. And I'll give you another example later of the absolute incredible, the necessity for timing. So we went in, or the bombers went in. They did a pretty good job of the rocketing and the bombers going in at about 60-degree angle, and therefore a little more difficult as a target to the ground flak people. We went in with our napalm, and that's about a 15-degree angle, and you're really setting yourself up for my leader got shot down actually there, Gordon Harvey.
I lost my number 2, was a bloke called Gordon Harvey. He spent 32 months as the guest of the Chinese as POW. We were doing a big raid on Pyongyang, on the so-called headquarters. Gordon got shot up and forced land on a icebound island, middle of the Han River, and he was captured. But the Yanks said, if you can find him next morning, you can have control of my whole Air Force. They laid on a carrier, they sent a carrier up the west coast, loaded the 2-3 helicopters. In the operation order that day, they gave me a special call sign. And if my call sign went out that I needed help to get Gordon Harvey out, the whole of the Air Force would turn in and help out. The Yanks did that. They were very amazing. Help their friends. We never got Gordon out, of course. We found photographs that he'd been captured and sent north.
Flight Lieutenant Gordon Harvey had executed a successful wheels-up landing on an island in the frozen Taedong River northwest of the North Korean capital before being taken prisoner. The first squadron pilot to fly 100 missions, he spent the rest of the war in appalling conditions in a Chinese POW camp. He was released on the 28th of August 1953. He later commanded 77 Squadron in Malaya, flying Avon Sabre fighters. In mid-January, the UN retreat ended 25 miles south of Seoul, then began a slow push north to recapture the South Korean capital. During the push, 77 Squadron lost another 3 pilots during operations. By the 15th of March 1951, Seoul had been retaken, and 77 Squadron continued to support the advancing troops and take a number of losses themselves.
UN ground forces on all fronts are pushing slowly and methodically northward toward the 38th parallel. They meet only light resistance as the Chinese communists fall back. On 21 March, Chuncheon falls without a fight. In an attempt to speed up the offensive and trap the large enemy force guarding the approaches to Pyongyang, the 187th Regimental Combat Team parachutes behind enemy lines in the Munsan area, just 12 miles below the parallel. At the same time, other UN forces drive northward along a 15-mile front above Seoul to meet them. However,
on the 23rd, the squadron participated in the largest parachute operation of the Korean War, Operation Tomahawk.
3,300 parachutists of the 187th Regimental Combat Team will participate in the operation. Into the C-119 flying boxcars, heavy equipment is loaded. 4.2-inch mortars, 105mm howitzers, and jeeps are prepared for the drop to support the parachute infantrymen. Air Force crew members get last-minute briefings. Pilots carefully recheck jump areas on maps, get latest weather report, and then prepare to take off. Troop carrier planes rendezvous over Taegu and fly northward.
Fighters and bombers have preceded these planes to soften up enemy resistance. Here's the jump area, 10 miles south of the parallel. At 0900 on Good Friday, 23 March, Brigadier General Frank S. Bowen's 187th Airborne RCT hits the silk over the rice paddies and rolling terrain of the jump area. The parachutists leave the troop carriers in sticks of 42 men from each plane at an altitude of 800 feet. As soon as all parachute personnel have jumped, the flying boxcars start delivering the heavy equipment. In this plane, jeeps and trailers are being dropped. A small parachute is released to aid in pulling the heavy cargo from the plane. More equipment and supplies are dropped as the parachutists quickly assemble and organize on the ground. The North Korean First Corps
8 Mustangs from the squadron escorted 120 USAF transport aircraft over the Munsani area. They then helped destroy any opposition from the enemy forces on the ground. UN forces finally crossed the 38th parallel for the second time on the last day of March. The last few months had taken quite a toll on the squadron. Accordingly, it was with some relief that, on the 4th of April, the squadron received the news that it was to withdraw to Iwakuni to begin converting onto the long-awaited Gloucester Meteor jet fighter. The squadron flew its last operational Mustang sortie on the 6th of April 1951, when 4 aircraft had to abort an attack on a North Korean road due to bad weather. Please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss part 2 of this story, when 77 Squadron convert to Meteor jet fighters and come head-to-head with the MiG-15 in dramatic and deadly dogfights.